The ship on Doll's screen had no right to be that calm. For the tow, and the pale meridian was coming apart the way careful things come apart, not all at once, but in the accumulation of small surrenders. I groaned from the secondary hull brace, the sharp percussion of a coolant line rupturing to decks below. The lights in the cartography bay had been flickering for 20 minutes, and nobody had gone to fix them, because the 2 crew members assigned to that task were both braced against load-bearing struts with their hands locked around support rails, waiting for the next shutter to pass. Doll had not moved from his station in 4 hours and 11 minutes. His fingers were wrapped around the edge of the console, not the calibration weight. The weight was in his coat pocket, completely still, because he was holding himself together with both hands and there was nothing left over for habit. Through the connecting viewport, 50 meters of pressurized corridor and 1 sealed airlock away, the Iron Shore ran at full thrust. And in the Iron Shore's bridge, visible through the viewport at this angle, if you knew where to look, Commander Rasha Ray Vixen at her command station, jaw set, knuckles pale on the armrest, eyes fixed on her screens. She was not calm. Doll had studied her long enough to know the difference between calm and what she was doing. What she was doing was something else, a kind of determined refusal, as if fear had come to her as a reasonable argument, laid out its case in full, and she had listened to the entire thing and then said no anyway. The wavefront was on sensors, a wall of light, patient, expanding. Doll looked at it, looked at her, looked back at it. His hand found his coat pocket. The weight was still. Stay close. The part that matters, the part I still don't have words for, that comes next. 47 hours before the Iron Shore appeared on sensors. The pale meridian was the quietest vessel in the threshold margin. This was not unusual. The margin was always quiet. It sat at the gravitational boundary between mapped accord space and the region cartographers called the outer scar, not because anything had torn it, but because the stars there were spaced irregularly, too far apart for comfortable jump calculations, too close together for the sensor arrays to work cleanly. The Accord had surveyed its edges 3 times over 6 centuries and found the same thing each time: empty, inhospitable, and unremarkable. The margin existed mostly as a bureaucratic category, a place where Accord jurisdiction technically ended, and no one had yet defined what came after. SOV and all had been assigned to this particular sector for 11 cycles because it was the kind of posting the Accord gave to surveyors who were good enough to not waste on anything interesting. He had catalogued 140 star systems in 280 years of service, and he understood his role with the clarity of a man who has long since made his peace with it. He was a cartographer. He drew edges. He filled in gaps on maps that other species would eventually use to do more exciting things. It was quiet work. He had come to value quiet. The calibration weight rolled across his knuckles. Back, forward, back, shoulder. 14 crew members moved through the amber light of the Meridian's bridge in the unhurried way of people who have not been surprised in a long time. Teth Suru, his communications officer, was running routine frequency sweeps that hadn't returned anything in 42 days. My HFY science lead was cataloging a modest asteroid field near the system's 4th planet with the focused attention of someone who genuinely found asteroid fields interesting, a quality Dahl respected privately as the kind of dedication that made good science possible. The rest of the crew handled navigation, life support, sensor calibration, hull maintenance, all of it familiar, all of it slow. The mission log read 847 cycles since last alert condition. Dahl was, if he was honest with himself, proud of this number. The Accord didn't reward surveyors for uneventfulness. There were no commendations for the absence of incident. But 847 cycles was a kind of testament to a certain mode of operating. Careful, methodical, nothing triggered that shouldn't be triggered. He had the weight doing a slow pass across his index finger when my Ray Th Saul's voice came across the bridge with a tone he hadn't heard from her in a long time. Senior cartographer. A pause. Something is holding position near the debris ring. Dahl looked up. The main display shifted to the survey feed from the 4th planetary approach. The debris ring was unremarkable, the remnant of a moon that had come apart sometime in the last several million years. Now a slow diffuse band of rock and ice circling a gas giant the color of old bruises. They had been documenting it for 6 cycles. Nothing ever held position near it. Something was holding position near it. Dark hull. Angular geometry. Armored in a way that had no explanation in the context of scientific survey work. Dahl's fingers closed around the calibration weight and went still. He knew, in a distant and clinical way, that his bioluminescent skin had just dimmed. He couldn't control it. The luminary had evolved emotional transparency long before they evolved the capacity to be embarrassed by it. His crew would see his light drop and understand what it meant. He didn't try to hide it, cross-reference against the full database. He said. His voice came out steady. Years of practice. Myra Th. Saul's hands moved across her console. The search algorithms ran. 30 seconds. A minute. No match, she said. No partial match. No structural family match in any surveyed category. Teth Sorrel had already turned from the frequency sweep. Her skin showed faint yellow alertness. Not yet fear. Shall I run the codex protocols? The containment codex, etched into the Meridian's command core on the day she was commissioned. As it was etched into every Accord vessel, Dahl knew its relevant section the way he knew his own crew manifest. Upon detection of vessel of unknown origin exhibiting Ruin-class construction signatures, initiate weapons lock. Engage full sensor suppression, and execute departure on safest available vector. Do not establish communication. Do not approach within 0.3 AU. Do not maintain visual contact beyond what is necessary for safe navigation. He thought about this for 3 seconds. Run the construction signature analysis first, he said. I want specifics before we make any decisions. Myra Th. Saul looked at him, just briefly. Then she turned back to her console. The results took 4 minutes. They arrived in segments, each one slightly worse than the last. Hull composition high density alloy. Layered. The outer plating was rated, and here the analysis system flagged this with the Accord equivalent of a double underline rated for sustained microparticle bombardment equivalent to grazing a stellar corona, not passing through a debris field, not operating near an active magnetic system, grazing a stellar corona. This was the hull of a vessel that had been designed for environments where the star itself was a hazard. Internal gravity 1.0 standard. The luminary lived and worked at 0.3. Most Accord species operated between 0.2 and 0.6. The SSRE, built for heavier worlds, reached 0.8 on their home vessels. 1.0 was the number the Accord used in stress calculations to represent catastrophic structural loading on biological systems. Radiation shielding deep composite lead alloy. 3-layer configuration. The kind used on vessels designed for extended operation in stellar exclusion zones. Dahl read this data 3 times. A Ruin-class construction signature. The codex was, technically, already triggered. Every protocol in the document pointed one direction. He looked at the angular ship sitting quiet near the debris ring. He looked at the calibration weight in his hand. Teth Sorrel, he said slowly, don't run the codex. Run the atmospheric scan. She hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then she ran it. Nitrogen, 78%. Oxygen, 21.4%. The bridge went completely silent. Dahl had been a cartographer for 280 years. He had charted systems with stellar radiation levels that would scour and shielded hulls in hours. He had documented worlds where the atmospheric chemistry reacted violently with any organic compound. He had surveyed a gas giant where the atmospheric pressure at the cloud layer would compress a standard Accord vessel into something roughly the size of a storage container. None of those readings had produced this particular quality of silence. Oxygen, at 21%. Any luminary crew member who breathed an oxygen concentration above 3% would suffer cellular damage within minutes. 8% caused acute injury. 12% was a documented fatality level. 21.4% was a number that didn't belong anywhere near the word atmosphere. It belonged near the word corroded. It belonged near material degradation studies and accelerated oxidation rates, and the question of how long an unshielded hull could survive before the reactive chemistry ate through the joins. And something was living in it. Life signs, Dahl said. Myra Th. Saul's hands were very still on her console. Reading now. Another silence. Longer this time. 41 life signs, she said. All warm-blooded. Internally regulated body temperatures at approximately 309 Kelvin, moving freely through the vessel. They pause, without environmental suits. Dahl absorbed this. 41 beings, walking through corridors saturated with corrosive gas. Standing upright under crushing gravity. Protected from the radiation environment by nothing but whatever biological material they had been built from. The codex said run. The codex had always been very clear on this point. Dahl looked at the weight in his hand, rolled it once, deliberately, as if testing whether his hand still worked. Teth Sorrel, he said. Open a contact channel. Standard first approach sequence. Mathematical primer, then the broad spectrum greeting package. She turned fully around this time. Not in protest, she would do what he asked. But she needed him to see that she was choosing to trust him, which was different from simply following an order. He saw. He nodded once. She turned back and opened the channel. The mathematical primer went out first primes. then geometric ratios, then a simple counting sequence in 3 bases, universal in the sense that any species capable of building an interstellar vessel would recognize the pattern. The greeting package followed simple images, 2 different geometric forms shown in proximity without aggression. The nearest thing the Accord had to a picture of a handshake. They waited. 40 seconds. The Iron Shore answered. The response came back in 3 layers, same as the primer, matching the structure precisely. Then it added something the Meridian hadn't sent, a 4th sequence, a continuation of the geometric pattern, extending it to steps further than the Accord's opening had gone, as if whoever had received the message had looked at it, understood it completely, and decided that the most natural response was to keep going. Dahl found himself leaning slightly forward. They extended the sequence. My Radi Saul said. There was something new in her voice. Not fear. Something more complicated. They didn't just confirm receipt. They completed it. I noticed, Dahl said. The translation architecture took 11 minutes to achieve functional baseline, longer than standard, because the linguistic distance was substantial, but the attempt from the other vessel was active and systematic. They weren't waiting for the Meridian to do all the work. They were feeding the system, offering cross-references, providing redundant samples. Dahl watched the translation logs build in real time and noticed that whoever was managing their linguistic systems understood how translation worked. They knew what kind of data the algorithm needed. They were giving it exactly that. The face that appeared on the main display was the first human face Dahl had ever seen. Bilateral symmetry, 2 forward-facing eyes, small by luminary standards, set beneath a brow ridge, constantly moving in small tracking arcs as if habituated to monitoring for threats from multiple vectors. A vertical midline structure that he would later learn served both olfactory and respiratory functions. A mouth with visible dentition, round skin, warm-toned, with a texture that suggested density rather than delicacy. She looked at the camera for exactly 2 seconds without speaking. Then she said, I have been waiting my entire career to say this sentence. The translation system processed the idiom clumsily. The full emotional content arrived slightly delayed, like a sound reaching you from across a large room. But it arrived. My name is Osharavik. I command the survey vessel Iron Shore. Out of a system you don't have a name for yet, but we call home. We received your signal. We are very glad you sent it. Dahl noticed, in a distant way, that his skin had returned to a normal working blue. He hadn't decided to let it do that. It had simply happened. He stepped forward. Senior Cartographer S.O.V. Rendall, he said. The pale meridian, registered to the Helionic Accord. He paused for a fraction of a second. We are also glad. The corner of her mouth moved upward. The motion showed her teeth. The translation system flagged this as a positive, effective display warmth. Genuine, not a threat signal. Dahl noted that it had taken the system 3 seconds to reach this interpretation, which meant it had seriously considered the alternative. We should probably talk about the logistics, Ravik said. Our ships have different air and different gravity, and we're going to need somewhere in the middle to actually stand in the same room. Practical. Immediate. No territorial declaration. No demand for the identification of Accord military assets or defensive capabilities. The first substantive thing she said after a greeting that would be analyzed in linguistics papers for the next 3 centuries was we should figure out where to meet. Dahl reached into his pocket. The weight was already moving. We have environmental suits rated for extreme pressure variance, he said. If your crew has equivalent equipment, I can propose a meeting configuration. We have suits for hard vacuum. We can work in whatever atmosphere you need. Dahl was quiet for a moment. Hard vacuum suits. He thought about what that implied, that their standard operating environment was already demanding enough that suits designed for the absence of any atmosphere were simply part of their carried equipment, not specialized gear brought for unusual missions. Standard kit. Then I'll transmit docking parameters, he said. We can meet in the collar at 0 point for standard gravity. I believe that falls within comfortable range for both crews. Ravik looked at someone off screen. A brief exchange in a language the translation system was still building scaffolding around. She turned back. 0 point for should work. We'll see you in there. A short pause. Dahl, this is a good day. The transmission ended. The bridge was very quiet for a moment. My Radi Saul broke it. The codex says. I know what the codex says. Dahl told her. Log a senior surveyor override. Authorization code follows. He gave the code. Then he stood there for a moment looking at the space where Ravik's face had been. She said it was a good day. Peth Sorrel said. From her station. She sounded thoughtful. She did. Dahl agreed. He began drafting the docking request. The docking collar was the only place in the known galaxy where 0 point for standard gravity and a carefully blended atmospheric mix were making two entirely different species equally uncomfortable. And by some process that Dahl couldn't entirely explain, this shared discomfort had become the most productive thing he'd experienced in decades. Ravik moved through the reduced gravity with the studied caution of someone who was resisting something. She stepped, and her body wanted to continue the step further than she allowed it, and she corrected with a small deliberate adjustment every time. Dahl noticed this on her second step and understood it a minute later. When he had context for it, she was used to walking in gravity 3 times heavier than this. In her normal environment, each step required more effort, more grounding, and here, she was holding herself back. The way you hold back a door that wants to swing further than you need it to. She was being considerate. The thought arrived in Dahl's mind without ceremony and stayed there. Her 3 crew members spread out slightly on entering instinctive. He suspected the habitual use of space to maximize perceptual coverage and then visibly corrected, drawing back into a more compact arrangement when they noticed his crew's response to the movement. Adaptable. Fez. They had read a social signal from a completely foreign species and adjusted within 3 seconds. Ravik stopped an appropriate distance away. She looked at him directly, both eyes forward, and he had the sudden understanding that forward-facing binocular vision was a predator configuration depth perception optimized for tracking moving targets. The Luminari had lateral eyes for panoramic awareness, the visual architecture of prey species who needed to see everything coming from every direction. She was looking at him the way a creature evolved to hunt looked at something it had decided not to hunt, which, he supposed, was the most reassuring version of that particular situation. "Thank you for the atmospheric compromise," she said. The translation system had improved significantly in the last 2 hours. The idiom was clean. "Our environmental suits are functional, but they're not conversational." "Your suit," Dahl said carefully, "are rated for vacuum exposure. Standard issue." "Yes. May I ask what conditions require that level of protection?" "For your crew. On a survey mission?" She smiled again, the tooth showing expression the translation system had firmly categorized as positive. Mostly the inconvenience of losing atmosphere unexpectedly. Hull breaches, airlock failures, standard hazards, APARs. "You're asking because the suit rating tells you something about what we're used to." "Yes. What does it tell you?" Dahl considered how to answer this. He decided the honest answer was better than the diplomatic one, because she had been honest with him and this seemed like a standard she maintained. "It tells me that vacuum exposure is a routine enough risk for your crew that you carry equipment designed to survive it as basic kit, not as emergency gear." "Basic kit." Ravik looked at him for a moment. Then she turned slightly to the compact man standing at her right shoulder. "VA cell. He's done it and we haven't even started the biology session yet." The compact man drive, or in VA cell, as Dahl would learn in the next few minutes, had a face that managed to express several competing things at once: amusement, professional eagerness, and something that looked like the specific pleasure of a person who has spent a long time thinking about a subject finally being given permission to explain it at length. "We should probably sit down for that," VA cell said. "Some of it takes a minute to absorb." They sat on opposite sides of a portable surface that Ravik's crew had brought across in sections and assembled in the collar's largest chamber, which was not designed for conferences, but was doing its best. VA cell had a display unit. He also had, Dahl noticed, a habit of touching his own arm or chest when illustrating a point, as if the body being described was most efficiently demonstrated by reference to an immediately available example. It started with the bones. "Calcium composite matrix," VA cell said, tapping his forearm. "Self-repairing. The body recognizes structural damage and initiates a regenerative process that fills the fracture with new material over several weeks. The repaired area typically achieves equivalent or superior tensile strength to the original." Dahl's science officer, Narration Saul, had her stylus raised to take notes. She lowered it. "Self-repairing," she said. "Yes, without surgical intervention." "Correct. You can accelerate it with medical support. But if you leave a standard fracture alone, the body handles it." Narration Saul looked at the stylus. She set it down. She picked it up again. She said, "How long?" "For 6 weeks for a clean break. Longer for complex fractures." A silence. "Luminary bone does not self-repair," Narration Saul said, in the tone of someone who has just had a belief they didn't know they held challenged. "A fracture requires immediate surgical reconstruction or the structural integrity is permanently compromised. Without intervention, the bone does not heal. It remains fractured." VA Cell received this information with the careful neutrality of a scientist trying not to respond to "that's fascinating" until he understood what the information meant to the person saying it. "I'm sorry," he said instead. "That sounds extremely stressful." My radiation Cell blinked. "It is. Rather. We are very careful. We're not," VA Cell said, almost cheerfully. "Historically we have been very bad at being careful, which is probably why the repair mechanism developed." He moved to the next section. The immune system took longer to explain, because the scope of it required building context first, the description of an environment so saturated with competing biological entities that the dominant intelligent species had developed an internal defense network of corresponding complexity. VA Cell described it as a standing army. Teth Suru, sitting slightly behind Doll, made a sound he hadn't heard from her before. "Your body contains," she said, measuring the words, "specialized cells whose only function is to identify and destroy other organisms. Billions of them, yes, operating continuously. And the organisms they fight? Bacteria, viruses, fungi, parasites. Some of them very old, some of them very fast evolving. The relationship goes back about 3.5 billion years, give or take. 3.5 billion years. It's an arms race," VA Cell said. He said it with the equanimity of a person describing the weather. "We get better at fighting. They get better at infecting. Neither side can fully win. The immune system is partly the record of every time the pathogens almost did. A slight pause. We are born outnumbered. We just don't negotiate." Doll's skin had shifted to a pale blue-gray. Not fear exactly. The color his species produced when encountering information that required significant reclassification of existing models. "The heart came next." "One," VA Cell said. "One heart," Doll said. "Just to confirm, one heart." Doll's species had distributed cardiac architecture, 3 small pumping chambers spaced through the body, each capable of independent operation, each able to rest while the others compensated. The system was robust in the way that redundancy always produced robustness. He had never considered this unremarkable before this moment. "It beats from before birth," VA Cell continued, "without rest. For the entire length of a human life, which currently averages approximately 80 of our years. Without stopping. If it stops for more than a few minutes, the person dies." Doll thought about this. He thought about 80 years of uninterrupted function from a single point of failure. He thought about the margin of error that represented. "Does it," he said slowly, "ever rest between beats?" There's a brief pause between contractions, but the muscle itself doesn't rest. If that's what you're asking, the pause is part of the beat cycle, not a rest state. Doll looked at Ravik. She was watching him with an expression he was still learning to read, something attentive, something slightly waiting. "You've been carrying a single point of failure in your chest since before you were born," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "We mostly don't think about it. That is," Doll said, and then paused, because the sentence was going somewhere his filters wanted to redirect it, and he decided to let it go. Either remarkable equanimity or a very effective coping mechanism. The corner of her mouth moved. Most probably, the stress response was last. VA Cell explained the neurogmerity with the clear enthusiasm of a person who finds neurogmerity genuinely interesting, which Doll appreciated even as the content of the explanation was producing a progressive shift in his skin toward colors he generally tried to suppress in professional settings. The adrenal cascade, the cardiovascular amplification, the sensory expansion, the pain suppression, the enhanced reaction speed, all of it involuntary, all of it triggered by threat detection. All of it designed to make a human being, at the moment of greatest danger, into something more capable of surviving that danger than they were in any other state. "So under threat," my radiation Cell said, her stylus motionless in her hand, "your species becomes stronger, faster, stronger, higher pain tolerance, better reaction time. Yes, your biology rewards being threatened by increasing your capacity to respond to the threat. In the short term, there are costs. Adrenaline is hard on the system over time. But in the moment, VA Cell agreed. Yes, my radiation Cell set down her stylus. She looked at it for a moment. She looked at Doll. She looked at the stylus again. "I need," she said carefully, "to revise approximately 40% of my working assumptions about this species." Doll found himself in the unusual position of agreeing with his science officer while simultaneously finding the conclusion insufficient. 60, he said. He heard Ravik exhale something that the translation system, in a development he found privately remarkable, correctly identified as suppressed laughter. The data drop came 2 days later, during a joint session on comparative spaceflight history. VA Cell was presenting a timeline. Ravik was nearby, reviewing navigation charts that Peth Sorrel had provided the first substantive exchange of Accord positional data with a non-member species in approximately 800 years. Dahl was sitting across from VA Cell with the weight rolling slowly across his knuckles. Not because he was afraid, or because he had fallen back into the habit of it, and the habit, right now, was functioning as an anchor. 90 years, VA Cell said, marking the timeline's current position. From first orbit to this survey. Yes, approximately 88 years from first achieved orbit to current date. Our first crewed orbit was 62 years ago. First crewed interstellar transit was 14 years ago. The wait stopped. Dahl looked at the timeline. He looked at the numbers on it. He did the calculation, which was very simple and produced a result. He then repeated in his head 3 times to confirm it was correct. The Accord, he said, took approximately 4,000 years from first atmospheric exit to achieved interstellar navigation. That sounds about right, based on what you shared. The fastest comparable development in our membership history was achieved by the ETH. They completed the same technological progression in approximately 800 years, which remains the fastest recorded development in the Accord's documented experience. VA Cell looked at him. He seemed to be calculating something. 88 years is faster than 800 years, he said, carefully, in the way that people speak when they are aware that what they are about to confirm nail and heavily. Yes, Dahl said, by a factor of approximately 9. He paused. I would like to ask you something directly. Go ahead. In the 90 years since your species first left your planet's atmosphere, how many people have you lost to spaceflight accidents? VA Cell was quiet for a moment. Then he said across all programs, international and private, roughly 1,400. The rate has been declining steadily. We consider it an acceptable and improving figure. Dahl absorbed this. 1,400 dead in 90 years of spaceflight. The Accord's total spaceflight fatality record across 11 species and 6,000 years of combined history was somewhere under 200. The Luminari had lost 7 people to spaceflight in their entire history. 7. You consider it acceptable. Dahl said, we consider the progress worth the cost. VA Cell said, which is not the same thing. Exactly. But we don't stop. Dahl thought about this. He thought about a species that climbed out of a world the Accord had classified as lethal. Lost 1,400 people learning how to reach space in the time it took most Accord species to build a second generation of survey vessels, and classified the casualty rate as improving. He thought about the angular dark hull of the Iron Shore sitting 50 meters away. He thought about Ravik moving through 0 point for gravity with the patient care of someone holding herself back from what her body wanted to do. He thought about the heart that beat without stopping, the bones that rebuilt themselves from injury, the immune system engaged in its 3.5 billion year war, the biology that became more dangerous precisely when danger arrived. He thought about the 1,400 dead and the word improving, and he began, for the first time, to understand that the containment codex had not described what the Accord actually feared about ruin-class species. It had described what the Accord had imagined. The fear was real, but the thing feared was fiction, assembled from extrapolation in a single committee session by species who had never left comfortable space and never needed to. He had the weight moving again before he noticed he'd started. The alert arrived without ceremony. No build-up, no warning cascade through secondary systems. One moment the pale meridian sensor array was running its standard sweep of the margin, cataloging the unremarkable, and the next moment every display on the bridge went the specific shade of deep amber that Dahl had not seen in 280 years of service and had privately hoped never to see at all. Gravimetric collapse, subspace fold, outer scar, bearing 742, distance approximately 0.8 AU and closing. Peth Sorrel was already running the numbers when Dahl reached his station. Her skin had gone flat, expressionless white, not the white of fear, which flickered, but the white of a professional suppressing everything irrelevant and working the problem. Wavefront velocity, Dahl said, calculating. A pause, expanding at approximately 0.4 AU per hour. Radiation profile is extreme full spectrum burst across all monitored bands. Anything unshielded within 0.6 AU at arrival will experience complete systems failure and biological fatality within seconds of exposure. Dahl did the calculation. The pale meridians at its 0.5 AU from the collapse point. Time to safe distance at maximum thrust. Peth Sorrel's hands stopped moving. Just briefly. The kind of stop that means the number has arrived and the person receiving it is deciding how to say it. At maximum sustained thrust. She said, we clear 0.6 AU in approximately 9 hours. Wayfront arrival, approximately 5 hours. 40 minutes. With significant uncertainty in the upper range, the collapse is accelerating. Dahl stood very still. 9 hours to safety. Under 6 hours, until the wall of light arrived. The math was not complicated. It did not become less clear on re-estimation. He ran it a third time anyway, the way you do when you are hoping the numbers will change. And they did not change, and he set that hope down carefully and moved on. Open a channel to the Iron Shore, he said. Ravik's face was on the display in under 30 seconds. She had clearly been awake. Her expression carried none of the residual softness that the translation system had taught Dahl to associate with interrupted sleep, and she had clearly already seen the sensor data her ship was generating. Because she was not asking what was wrong. She was waiting for him to tell her what he needed. Commander Ravik, Dahl said, I need to inform you of a developing situation. I'm already looking at it, she said. Tell me your thrust numbers, he told her. She looked at somewhere off screen. A brief exchange. Fast and clipped. The kind that happens between people who have worked together long enough to compress a technical conversation into 8 words. She turned back. What are your hull structural weak points? Dahl processed the question. It was not the question he had expected. He had expected an expression of regret, or a recommendation that the Meridian attempt to accelerate on its own to whatever distance it could achieve, or a professional acknowledgement that there were situations physics did not permit solutions to. He had not expected the question he was being asked. Commander, he said carefully, I don't believe that information is what we're towing you out, she said. The Iron Shore has the thrust profile to pull both ships to safe distance in time if we start immediately. I need to know where your hull can't take the cable stress. She paused for exactly 1 second. Tell me your weak points. The weight in Dahl's pocket had gone completely still. He found the structural survey files. He transmitted them. What followed was the most technically demanding 90 minutes of Dahl's career, and he spent most of it watching other people work. The Iron Shore's engineering team moved with a speed that Dahl's crew found difficult to process, not because the luminari were slow, but because human urgency operated at a register that simply had no equivalent in a chord movement culture. They emerged from the Iron Shore's port airlock in environment suits, carrying cable assemblies that the translation system helpfully informed Dahl were rated for salvage operations in high-mass debris fields. And they crossed the exterior of both vessels with the practiced efficiency of people who had clearly done this before, something close enough to it that the skills transferred without friction. My H. Saul stood at the viewport with her fractured stylus. She had dropped it during the initial alert, and the casing had cracked watching them. They're moving very fast, she said. Yes. Dahl agreed. Is that their normal operational tempo? I believe, Dahl said. It may be their response to an accelerating deadline. My H. Saul watched a human crew member cross a section of hull that the structural survey had flagged as a moderate stress concern. Noted the point where the cable assembly was anchored instead, and said they read the survey file. They did, in the time it took us to transmit it and them to suit up. Apparently. She looked at the cracked stylus. She set it down on the ledge of the viewport. She said nothing further, but the silence had a quality to it that Dahl recognized as the sound a scientist makes when rebel in real time. The cables took tension 37 minutes after the first transmission. Dahl heard it before he saw the effect on the displays, a deep harmonic groan that traveled through the Meridian's hull from the anchor points, a sound the ship had never made in 847 cycles of quiet operation, a sound that meant forces were being applied to the structure for which the structure had not been designed. Every luminary crew member on the bridge registered the sound with a visible physical response. Skins flickered. Postures shifted. Several hands moved to console ledges and gripped them. The Meridian began to move. Slowly, then less slowly. The acceleration was not the smooth linear gain of a vessel moving under its own power. It came in a slight oscillation, a rhythmic pressure and release as the cable geometry settled and the Iron Shore's engines found the load. But it was movement. Real. Measurable. Physics-compliant movement in the correct direction. We are accelerating. Heth Sorrel said. The steadiness in her voice cost her something. Confirm the vector, Dahl said. Confirmed. Bearing toward minimum safe distance. She looked at the wavefront projection. Time to safe distance at current rate 6 hours. For minutes. The wavefront would arrive in 5 hours and 40 minutes. Maybe less. Given the acceleration Ren. 24 minutes short. Time estimate is still within tolerance uncertainty. Dahl said. mostly for the benefit of his crew. The collapse rate has variance. We maintain course and we update the projection. Nobody said what everyone understood, that the variance could go the other way. R2. My radiate Sol had a fractured wrist. She had not told anyone. Dahl learned about it when he noticed that she was using her left hand exclusively on the sensor console, and that her right hand was positioned against the console's edge in a way that appeared casual and was not, because nothing my radiate Sol did was casual. Report, he said quietly, passing her station. Stress fracture. Secondary strut failed during the first acceleration surge. I caught the edge on the way down. She said this the way a person reports a minor instrument malfunction. It's functional. I can work. Medical bay. The wrist is functional. She said again. I would prefer to stay. Dahl looked at her. She looked back at him with the particular expression of a scientist who has decided what she considers important and does not intend to be argued out of it. Stay, he said. Log it for treatment at the first available opportunity. She was already back on the sensors. Dahl moved to his station and opened the iron shore channel. Ravik was at her station. Had been, he suspected, for the entire hours, her second in command at all. Quiet officer named PR asked, whose communication style ran to precise short statements and no unnecessary words, was handling systems coordination. Ravik herself was watching the numbers. She looked up when the channel opened. How's your crew? She asked. Managing. One injury so far. Non-critical. He paused. How is yours? Tired. She said it without complaint. A simple description. The engines are running hot. My chief engineer says we have margin. I'm choosing to believe her. The translation system had given all the idiom choosing to believe some time ago. He understood it now as a specifically human expression, the acknowledgement that trust was not certainty, but a decision made in the absence of certainty. The Accord didn't have an equivalent phrase. Accord species tended to act only when their confidence levels reached acceptable thresholds. Humans, apparently, sometimes just decided. Commander, Dahl said. I want to ask you something. Go ahead. He thought about how to phrase it. Then he decided, again, that the direct version was better. Why are you doing this? She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for an answer. The quiet of someone deciding which answer to give. There is a war, she said finally. A long time ago. Longer than I was alive. But not so long it stopped mattering. One side took prisoners from the other. The prisoners were cold and sick, and they had been trying to kill the people who captured them. Maybe the week before. Maybe the day before. She was watching the engine readouts while she spoke, her eyes moving between screens and the steady pattern Dahl had come to recognize as her monitoring baseline. One of the guards had a choice. She could treat the prisoners as enemies, which was accurate, or she could treat them as people who were cold and sick. A brief pause. She gave them blankets, medicine. She dressed their wounds, and when asked why, she said the right thing to do doesn't require the other person to deserve it. Rafik looked into the camera, directly, the way she always looked at things, both eyes. Full attention, no deflection. I'm doing this because you needed help and we were able to give it. That's the whole answer. Dahl sat with this for a moment. The Codex, he said, predicted that your species would act exclusively in self-interest. What Codex? Our standing directive on Ruin-class contact. It was written approximately 6,000 years ago. He paused. It recommended that we run. Ravik looked at him for a moment. Did you consider it? I overrode it. Something shifted in her expression. Not the tooth showing warmth. Not the focused attention. Something quieter. Good, she said. RE4. This was the hour Dahl would describe later, in contexts where precision mattered, as the hour when understanding arrived. Not gradually, the way it had been arriving in increments since the iron shore first appeared on his sensors, but all at once, in the way that understanding sometimes waits for the right angle of light. He looked through the connecting viewport. The corridor beyond was dim. The iron shore had reduced non-essential lighting to divert power to the engines, and the connecting passage sat at the low end of the priority list. Through that dim corridor, through the viewport in the far hatch, he could see the edge of the iron shore's bridge. Ravik was at her station. She had been there for 4 hours. She would be there for another 2. She was not comfortable. Her posture showed the accumulated weight of sustained physical and mental output, the slight forward lean that develops when a person has been maintaining alertness for too long, the occasional roll of the neck that indicated tension accumulating in the upper back. She was tired. Her hands were pale on the armrest from the grip she was maintaining, and she was afraid. Dahl had learned to read human faces over 6 days of careful observation, and he was reading hers now, and the thing he was looking at was not calm. It was a face that had received the information that they might not make it, that the variance in the wavefront projection could go wrong, that the cables could fail, that the engines could fail, that physics was not obligated to accommodate good intentions, and had decided to be here anyway. Not because she had concluded the risk was acceptable, because she had decided what kind of person she was. The weight in Dahl's coat pocket was absolutely still. He had stopped it without noticing. He understood. At this angle, in this dim light, watching a human being be afraid and stay anyway, that this was what the Codex had never been able to model. Not capability, not the biology, the armored hull, the gravity tolerance, the immune system, the single tireless heart. Those things were measurable. Those things could be assessed and rated and classified and written into a policy document by a committee of careful minds. What could not be modeled was the choice. The Codex had assumed that a species shaped by a lethal world would become an expression of that world. It had assumed that the product of extreme selection pressure was a creature optimized for survival, which meant aggression, which meant threat, which meant run. It had not accounted for the possibility that a species shaped by a lethal world might develop, alongside all the biological armor and the stress response in the tireless heart, a capacity for compassion that had itself become a survival mechanism. That 41 beings might sail 18 months through empty space hoping to find something that didn't know they existed. That a commander might cable her ship to a stranger's hull and drag it out of a radiation storm because the right thing to do doesn't require the other person to deserve it. Dahl took the weight from his pocket. He held it for a moment. Then, deliberately, he began rolling it across his knuckles again. Or 5.5. A secondary coolant line in the Iron Shore's engineering section failed. Dahl learned about it the way he learned about most things on the Iron Shore, not from Ray Vick, who had a tendency to handle problems before reporting them, but from the brief spike in the shared sensor feed that indicated a heat differential anomaly in the Iron Shore's port engineering bay, followed 30 seconds later by a drop in the bay's power draw that suggested either something had shut down or someone had bypassed it. Iron Shore Engineering, he heard Ray Vick say across the internal channel that was now patched to the Meridian's bridge speakers by mutual agreement. What's your timeline? The response came from someone he hadn't spoken to directly, a voice that was clipped even by human standards, every word stripped to its minimum. Bypass is manual. 20 minutes if I don't hit complications. Time we have. Confirmed. Working. Dahl watched the heat differential on the shared sensor feed. It climbed for 6 minutes. Held. Began to decline. 14 minutes later, the engineer Dahl had learned her name was via Scar, and that she had a habit of beginning every status report with a number said bypass complete. Cooling restored. We're clean. Ray Vick said good. 2 words exchanged. The entire interaction, from failure to resolution, had taken 17 minutes and produced no visible change in anyone's operational behavior. Nobody on the Iron Shore Bridge had stopped what they were doing. Nobody had escalated. They had identified the problem, assigned it, and continued working while someone solved it, trusting that the person assigned would either solve it or report that it couldn't be solved, at which point they would move to the next option. Dahl thought about this for a moment, about the distributed problem-solving architecture of a crew that had learned, somewhere along the way, to trust each other completely under pressure, about the specific quality of competence that developed in species whose environment didn't allow for extensive deliberation. He thought about the Accord's standard crisis protocols, which involved 4 layers of authorization and a consensus requirement before any non-routine action could be taken. He thought about how those protocols would have functioned in this situation. He thought about a lot of things in our 5.5. We're going to make it, Peth Sorrel said. She said it quietly, not as announcement but as confirmation, checking it against reality to see if reality agreed. The wavefront projection had shifted in the last 20 minutes. The collapse was decelerating slightly, the expansion rate dropping from its peak. The margin, which had been 24 minutes short 2 hours ago, had opened to 11 minutes of clearance. 11 minutes, against the scale of the crisis. 11 minutes was a number that invited no comfort at all, but 11 minutes was on the right side of 0, and that was the only relevant criterion. Confirm, Dahl said. Confirmed. At current rate, both vessels clear minimum safe distance with approximately 11 minutes to spare. The bridge was quiet for a moment. Then, from different stations, at different times, his crew's skin began to shift. The flat whites and grays of sustained stress began to warm, incrementally, toward the amber and blue of people who have been afraid for a long time and are beginning to believe, cautiously, that the fear has a defined endpoint. Dahl opened the Iron Shore channel. Ray Vick was looking at the same numbers. She looked up when the channel opened. 11 minutes, she said. Yes. A brief silence, the kind that happens between people who have been through something and are arriving together. At the moment when it becomes past tense, Scar wants me to tell you, Ravik said, that your hull performed well. She was monitoring the cable stress throughout and said the meridian structure handled the load better than projected. She wants to know what material your secondary bracing struts are made of. Dahl found himself, improbably, in the position of having a materials science conversation in the aftermath of a near-extinction event. He appreciated this. It was exactly the kind of thing that made the universe, in his considered opinion, worth cataloging. I'll have my Ray Sol transmit the specifications, he said. She'd appreciate that. Ravik paused. How's her wrist? Dahl looked across the bridge. My Ray Sol was still at her station. Right hand now slightly elevated on the console ledge in a way that minimized pressure on the fracture. Left hand doing all the actual work. Eyes on her screens with the focused calm of someone who had decided the injury was simply not relevant to the task. Still fractured, Dahl said. Still working. The corner of Ravik's mouth moved. Yeah, that tracks. The wavefront hit at exactly the projected time. From 0.65 AU, with both ships safely beyond the threshold. The sensor arrays recorded it in full. The expanding wall of radiation crossed the 0.6 AU boundary, continued outward, and consumed the space where the pale meridian had been sitting 47 hours earlier without pause or ceremony. It was beautiful in the way that lethal things sometimes are a pure expression of physics operating without intention, without mercy, without any reference to the fact that something had just barely not been there when it arrived. Peth Sorrel watched the sensor feed in silence. 847 cycles without an alert condition, she said eventually. Yes, Dahl agreed. And then, she gestured at the display. And then, he agreed. He was already thinking about the report. The pale meridian reached Callum's drift 3 days later. The drift was technically disputed territory. 3 species had overlapping historical claims on the way station, and the Accord had resolved the dispute in the characteristically Accord fashion of declaring it jointly administered and therefore everyone's responsibility and therefore, in practice, nobody's priority. The station ran on skeleton staff. It had adequate fuel, adequate repair facilities, and a communications relay powerful enough to reach the nearest Accord hub in approximately 16 hours. My radiated Sol had her wrist treated by the drift's medical officer, who told her the fracture was clean and that she had been fortunate it wasn't worse, and who received her account of how the injury had occurred with the expression of someone trying to determine whether towing cable stress during an emergency extraction from a gravimetric radiation event was a standard category on the incident form. It was not. Dahl sent his preliminary report from the drift. Flagged urgent, addressed to the office of the High Arbiter. He wrote it 3 times. The first version was the one a good surveyor writes: factual, systematic, structured around the data. First contact confirmed. Species designation human. Planet of origin Ruin 3 in the outer scar. Vessel encountered Iron Shore. Survey class, Crew 41. Atmospheric profile, gravity profile, biological assessment. Codex override authorization logged. First contact protocols conducted according to modified Accord guidelines given circumstances. He read it back. It was accurate. It was also, he felt, a description of a room that communicated nothing about what the room contained. The second version was longer. He added the biology sessions. He added the spacefoot timeline. He added the 1400 dead classified as acceptable and improving. He added Ravik's response to the towing question, not paraphrased, but transcribed directly from the translation logs. Because the original language was the point, he read that one back too. Better. Still insufficient. The third version began differently. The Containment Codex's section on Ruin-class behavioral prediction, he wrote, contains no empirical data. I have verified this. Every behavioral projection in the relevant sections is explicitly derived from theoretical modeling, not from documented contact. The document is, in this respect, a very long and very authoritative work of imagination. It was written by species who feared what they had never encountered, and it describes, with great precision and zero accuracy, a version of what we feared. I have encountered what we feared. I am requesting an emergency session of the full Accord assembly. He transmitted the third version. Then he went to find Ravik. She was in the drift's observation bay, which had a viewport that faced the outer scar. The stars there were spaced irregularly, scattered in a way that suggested they had been distributed by a process less orderly than the Accord's map regions. They looked, Dahl thought, like the stars looked in the earliest charts before the surveys, before the catalogs. when the universe was simply what was out there and nobody had yet imposed a system on it. Ravik was sitting with a cup of something hot. She looked at him when he entered and moved slightly on the bench to indicate the available space beside it, which he took. "Sent your report?" she said. "The third draft." "How bad was the first one?" "Accurate," Dahl said. "Which is its own kind of inadequate." She nodded, looking at the scar. "I sent mine too. It'll take a while to get home. But," she turned the cup in her hands, "my mission specialist described you as I'm translating this structurally impractical but extremely interesting." He meant it as a compliment. I'll choose to receive it as one. They almost laughed again. He was getting better at anticipating it. "What happens now?" she said. "On your end, with the Accord?" Dahl considered the question. He had thought about it at length during the transit to the drift. In the hours when the ship was running quietly and there was time to think, the Accord has not admitted a new member species in 400 years, he said. The process requires a full assembly session, testimony from the surveyor of record, a period of deliberation, and a vote requiring a 2/3 majority. The process typically takes between 2 and 8 years. Typically, I have requested an emergency session. Ravik looked at him. "The grounds," Dahl said, "are that the containment codex is currently active for your species. Any Accord vessel that encounters the Iron Shore or any other human vessel in the coming months will trigger automatic weapons lock-in evacuation. Given your probable survey routes and the distribution of Accord patrol coverage, the mathematical likelihood of an armed incident within the next year is approximately 34%. Ravik was quiet for a moment. "That's a specific number. I had time to calculate it on the way here." She looked at the cup. "And the emergency session will happen. Whether they vote the way I intend to argue is less certain." "What are you going to argue?" Dahl thought about the calibration weight, sitting in his coat pocket, warm from 3 days of near-continuous contact. He thought about the codex document open on his terminal, its confident projections about species that had been written specifically to never meet. He thought about 41 people breathing corrosive gas and standing in crushing gravity and sailing 18 months toward a universe that didn't know they existed. "Hoping, I'm going to argue," he said slowly, "that the codex was written by people who had never been afraid enough to need a stranger's help, and that every assumption it makes about your species derives from that particular failure of imagination." Ravik was quiet for a moment. Outside, the outer scar turned in its slow, indifferent arc. "Will they listen?" she said. "Some of them. The HFY or ETH will be the hardest. They have the most invested in the current protocols." "What do they fear?" "What you'll become," Dahl said. "Once you see what's possible." He paused. "They're not wrong that you'll change. They're wrong about what that means." Ravik turned the cup in her hands. Steam rose from it in a thin curl. "You know what I think the strangest part is? Tell me. We spent decades, before the Iron Shore launched, making lists of everything that might go wrong with first contact. We wrote protocols for hostile encounters, for ambiguous encounters, for species that communicated in ways we couldn't parse. We trained for fear and aggression and territoriality." She looked at the cup. "And then the first thing the first alien we met did was try to run away." Dahl's skin flickered with something he didn't immediately have a name for. After a moment he identified it as the color he produced when he found something precisely true. "To be fair," he said, "I overrode the running." She looked at him. The tooth-showing expression arrived warm and sudden. "Yeah," she said, "you're dead." The obsidian chamber had been carved from a single asteroid over a period of 3 centuries. The stone was dark and dense and held heat poorly, which meant that the chamber was always slightly cold, which the Accord's founding architects had apparently considered appropriate for a space dedicated to significant decisions. The dome overhead was a live display of the galaxy in real time, updated by relay station feeds from across Accord space. Every session. The same stars. Every session. Slightly different, because the galaxy was always moving and the Accord had long since decided it was important to remember that. Dahl stood at the center floor and looked up. 11 species looking back at him. The Luminari delegation sat to his left, their light a controlled neutral blue supportive. He hoped, though the Accord did not officially recognize the concept of delegation solidarity, that the SSRE occupied the tier directly ahead, their spherical bodies arranged in the precise geometric spacing their culture required for formal assembly. The HFY or ETH were elevated, for arms folded across iridescent shells, for sets of compound eyes tracking Dahl with the attentiveness of species whose evolutionary history had selected hard for threat assessment. High Arbiter Veldhomar sat at the chamber's apex. She was very old. Her bioluminescence had faded to a near-constant pale gold, the light of a species in late life. and she moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned over centuries to make each movement count. She had presided over this chamber for longer than all had been alive. He had read accounts of previous sessions she had chaired, and in all of them, her most consistent characteristic was patience. She looked at him now with the patience of someone who had heard many things in this chamber and had learned to wait for the thing underneath the words. "Senior Cartographer Dahl," she said, "your preliminary report has been reviewed in full. The Assembly is prepared to hear your testimony." Dahl's skin was neutral. He had spent the transit to the Accord Hub practicing neutral, not suppression. Suppression was visible, and visible suppression communicated as much as open expression. Actual neutral. The color of a luminar eye who has decided what he thinks and is not afraid of the room. He began with the data, the construction signature, the atmospheric profile, the gravity and radiation readings. He walked them through the biology session, summarizing VA cells material in the clinical language the Accord used for species assessment. He watched the room's color change as he spoke, subtle shifts in the ambient bioluminescence of 11 species registering the information. When he reached the stress response section, the HFY representative made a sound. Short, percussive. The translation system flagged it as the HFY equivalent of an interruption request. "Deldomar," the representative said, "the testimony to this point confirms everything the containment codex predicts. A species biologically optimized for violence, evolved in conditions hostile to all known life. The surveyor himself describes a neurological threat amplification system. I move that we..." "The surveyor has not finished," Deldomar said, quietly. "The way old authority speaks, it doesn't need volume." The HFY representative was silent. Dahl continued. He described the spacefoot timeline. He watched the room absorb the number 88 years. Against the HFY's 800. Against the Accord standard of 4,000. He watched the SSRE delegates exchange subsonic communication through the floor. The vibrations too low for Dahl to feel, but visible in the subtle lean of their bodies toward each other. He described the towing operation. He described it in specific terms: the cable ratings, the hull stress data, the 6 hours, the wafer window, the Iskar's coolant bypass, my rate H. Saul's fractured wrist, and the fact that she stayed at her station. He read Ray Vick's answer to his question directly from the translation log, verbatim, without commentary. Then he stopped. He let it sit in the room for a moment. The Containment Codex's behavioral prediction model, he said, describes a species that optimizes for self-interest above all other considerations. It predicts that ruin-class contact, if it occurred, would produce immediate territorial escalation followed by resource assessment and probable hostility. This prediction was not derived from observation. There has been no previous documented contact with any ruin-class species. The prediction was derived from theoretical extrapolation performed by species who had no empirical basis for it. He paused. Commander Ray Vick did not ask whether saving my crew would benefit her mission. She did not assess whether the Pale Meridian carried anything worth the risk of the operation. She asked me where my hull was weakest so that her engineers could avoid putting the cable anchors there. He looked at the HFY section. That is not the behavior of a species that optimizes for self-interest. That is the behavior of a species that has decided what it values and acts accordingly, regardless of cost. The HFY representative's shell made a sound. It proves what one crew did, under one set of conditions. It does not prove what the species will do when their numbers are larger. When they have more ships, when they have Accord technology. A pause. What happens then? Dahl had expected this question. He had prepared for it the way you prepare for a question whose answer cannot be proven, only argued. They went looking for us, he said. They had no evidence we existed. The Accord has been in space for 6.0 years. We've left detectable signals throughout the galaxy. We have navigational beacons, relay stations, survey markers on 12,000 worlds. Any species with interstellar capability has access to the evidence that something intelligent was out there. Humans spent 18 months sailing toward that evidence with no confirmation we would be friendly, no knowledge of our capabilities, no guarantee they would survive the encounter. He let that sit. That is not the behavior of a predator. A predator assesses odds first. What Commander Ray Vick's crew did is the behavior of something lomular and braver than anything the Codex imagined. Silence in the chamber, although Mar had not moved. There are 3 species in this assembly, Dahl continued, who have existing survey routes that intersect with probable human expansion vectors over the next 12 months. The Containment Codex currently designates any human vessel as a Class 1 threat requiring automatic weapons response. If an Accord patrol vessel encounters the Iron Shore, or any other human vessel, under current protocols, the encounter will go badly. The question before this assembly is not whether humans are dangerous. They are. The question is whether we are going to do something about it before the situation makes the decision for us. He stopped. Higher bidder Veldomar looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the galaxy turning overhead. The assembly will recess for deliberation, she said. 2 hours. Dahl waited in the antechamber. The calibration weight moved across his knuckles. Right. Forward. He was not trying to suppress anything. He had said what he had come to say and the rest was not his to control, and he was attempting to hold this truth with some measure of equanimity. The SSRE delegation passed him on their way to their deliberation, and the delegate closest to him slowed slightly as she passed, not stopping, not making eye contact, but the brief deceleration was itself a communication in the SSRE social grammar. And the translation system, which had grown sophisticated on this particular trip, flagged it as "I heard you, and I am thinking." He chose to take it as positive. An hour and 40 minutes in, Path Sorrel sent him a message from the drift. Short. Ravik asks how is the weight? Dahl looked at the object in his hand for a moment. Moving, he sent back. The vote was 8-3. Though Mar announced it without preamble. The way significant numbers are sometimes better received directly, without architecture around them. 8 in favor of provisional membership and immediate codex reclassification for human vessels. 3 against. And Dahl had predicted which 3, and the Caviar ETH representative's objection was noted for the record with the gravity its source deserved. Although Mars' conditions were 2 in number. First, the codex reclassification would be provisional pending a formal diplomatic mission to the human home system, which the Accord would dispatch within the year. Second, humanity would be informed, in full, of what they were being offered, what the Accord was, and what the history of the standing protocols had been. Not a sanitized version, the full record, including the fact that the Accord had been prepared to treat them as a threat category for the entirety of their spacefaring history. They should know the complete truth. Veldomar said, not because we owe them a confession, because they are about to become part of a community built on the principle that accurate information is the foundation of functional consensus. We cannot begin that relationship with an omission of this size. There was no dissent on the conditions. Dahl stood in the antechamber afterward. Among the dispersing delegates, in the particular stillness that follows the resolution of something that has been uncertain for a long time, his skin was neutral, or near to it. He reached into his coat pocket. The weight was warm from the hours of contact. He took it out and held it in his palm for a moment. Feeling the specific mass of it, a thumb-sized piece of titanium that had traveled with him for 280 years, through 140 catalog systems, through every quiet posting and unremarkable survey and careful operation that had never once produced a situation requiring more than routine judgment. He rolled it across his knuckles. Back. Forward. Not the still grip of a man suppressing fear. The slow, habitual movement of a man who was thinking about what came next and found that what came next was genuinely, improbably, open. He sent Path Sorrel the message for Ravik. Short. Because she would understand short. 8-3. The doors open. On the pale meridian, Dr. Callum's drift, my Radiate Saw was running materials analyses on the Iron Shore's hull specifications with her left hand and her newly splinted right arm elevated on a foam support, because the drift's medical officer had been very clear about the elevation requirement and somewhat less clear about the definition of rest. The analysis results were remarkable. She added them to the growing file she had begun on day 2 of the contact and had not stopped adding to since. The file was called, because she was a scientist and preferred accurate labels. What we got wrong, it was currently 847 pages long. She expected it to get longer. On the Iron Shore, Asha Ravik received Dahl's message in the observation bay, where she had returned after the session. She read it once. She set the communications pad down on the bench beside her and sat with it for a moment. The outer scar turned in the viewport. All those irregular stars, distributed by whatever process had scattered them, unremarked upon for however long they had been burning. She stood. She picked up the pad. She walked to the navigation bay. Pierast looked up from the console when she came in. New heading, she said. He turned to the console. She gave him the coordinates, Accord space, the diplomatic relay point they had been provided in the pre-contact package. The one that had seemed theoretical when they'd loaded it and was now simply the next destination. Plotting now, Pierast said. The Iron Shore's engines began their slow build. The ship turned. Gradual and deliberate. and the stars in the forward viewport tree arranged themselves into a configuration that was different from any they had held before. Not better stars. Not worse. Different. In the specific way that the future is different from the past, further away from what you know, oriented toward what you don't yet. Ravik stood in the navigation bay and watched them for a moment. Then she went to find VA's cell, because they had a lot of preparation to do, and she had always thought best where she was moving. The iron shore flew on into the uncharted dark. Behind it, at the edge of the outer scar, the last traces of the wavefront dispersed into background radiation, indistinguishable now from the ambient noise of the universe going about its business. The pale meridian's running lights moved slowly through the drift stalking arc, a small bright point against the irregular scatter of the scar's stars. In the obsidian chamber, the galaxy turned overhead, the same as it always had, the same as it always would. Every star slightly different from where it had been the last time anyone looked.